at that time. Okay, I'll dig in. So I'm very happy to be here as part of the LHE Global Festival. Gone way, it's a great start. Way through my slides. My name is Olga and this is Jeremy. Jeremy's my co-host. So I was going to say I'm calling in from University College Dublin. I'm not. If I was in the office, I would be. I'd be in the lovely Belfield campus. Just to give you a bit of context about University College Dublin, the kind of environment that we're working in, we've got over 30,000 students and almost 4,000 staff between academic and support staff. There's some UCD people here. I saw some familiar names, and they're here as part of the Work Smarter Together community of practice. We would have advertised this session there as well. The community of practice is an opportunity for UCD staff to come together to share and to learn and celebrate, and it's sponsored by UCD Agile, which is the unit that I work in. So UCD Agile it's a small support unit in the university, and to simplify it, we work to help staff and management make the best use of our resources to the best effect. I'm just going to minimize the stuff I have on my screen. And my role in UCD Agile as Agile lead is to run projects, design and facilitate workshops, deliver training, topics like lean and waste, if you're playing a drinking game, come up, coaching, mentoring, and I suppose of most relevance to this presentation today is I was the project manager for the Student Experience Mapping Project. A bit more background about myself. I have been in UCD forever. I was first a computer science student way too many years ago. I went on to do my PhD in computer science. I was then a lecturer in computer science. And then I went on into various roles around project management and lean as a staff member. So I feel like I'm somewhat qualified to be the project manager of a student experience mapping project. Before we get into the details, I'd like to know just a little bit about you in terms of experience mapping. What's your experience mapping experience? Jeremy will launch a poll for me there if you don't mind, and we'll get a sense of where people are coming from. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to complete the poll. Oh, Jeremy, on my side, I can't see if people are clicking.
Answers are flying in already. We're nearly at 100%. 30
Very
seconds,
compliant.
maybe too long.
Oh, well, you can close it when you're ready.
I may be wrong. It may not be too long. We're at around about 30 seconds. We've got 27 of 29 responses, so 93%. Yeah,
I'll take it.
I will end the polling now.
And share the results. So, this is my first time hearing about experience mapping, okay? Heard of it, never done it, planning on doing it soon, and I've done it before. So I've no pros, which kind of makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. But that's good. Hopefully there'll be something in it for everybody. So with that in mind, I'll try and hone where I focus in on. But essentially what I'm going to do is tell you our story of experience mapping. And what I'm aiming to do in telling you that story is giving you an understanding of what experience mapping is, which will be helpful for people who've never heard of it before. Why you would do it within higher education, so the value that we got out of it, hopefully you'll learn something from that. What doing experience mapping might look like in practice. So obviously I can't give you a complete detailed crash course in 45 minutes, but I'll give you a sense of how it worked. And then how you can continue to get value from experience mapping as time passes and the context changes. So how do you keep it alive, especially in circumstances like we're in now with COVID-19? So as I said, I have been in UCD forever, so I feel like I have a good sense of what the student experience looks like. It's more than just lectures and exam halls. It's all of the things that you get as a student. In UCD, you can see the lake over here. I've spent a long time sitting by the lake, eating lunch, chatting with my friends, hanging out, looking at the posters in the various buildings where all of the societies were advertising, being part of Freshers Week and, you know, all of the celebrations that you get, using campus facilities, eating, hanging out, studying on campus. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So it's more than just the teaching and learning experience, although being in lecture theatres was a significant amount at the time. There's also various ways that students interact, and this has probably changed a lot since I was a student too. There's a lot of focus on technology, the systems. There's a massive campus, particularly in, well, massive, I suppose, to us in UCD. I'm conscious as people from all over the world, so their campuses, it's all relative, isn't it? But the people you interact with and the technology you interact with, it all differs depending on the university you're in. And I suppose, having been a student, I feel like I have a good understanding of it, but I'm not actually the same demographic as our students. So do I really understand how they're experiencing the university? And if you look at this chart here, it's the age profile of the staff and faculty in the university. And I would wager that not a lot of us actually can really see through the eyes of the students. What we really see is the org structure of the university. Anybody from UCD will recognise this academic structure. It's on the it's a poster on the walls of many an office on campus when we're working from office. And what we see is how we're organised. We see the various units or departments, and they're organised based on the function. Students don't really see us that way. So there's a bit of a gap then in the perception and how we understand our students. I want to pause here for another poll, not to do poll fatigue like Zoom fatigue, but there's only 3 in total. What I'd like to know is what your role in relation to students is. So typically, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, Jeremy, typically when I'm talking to staff, if they're a lecturer or a TA, or if they're directly supporting students, they have an understanding of the student experience that somebody like me, who isn't directly in contact with students, I don't necessarily have the same understanding. So I'd just like to get a sense of who my audience is here.
90% voted so far.
They're on the ball.
They are. They've been at it for 30 seconds now.
Whenever you're ready.
All right. I shall end the polling and share the results.
No direct student contact. So this is really interesting. And we've got 20% of people frontline direct student supports. Really interesting. So most of you are actually like me. Okay, I was a student once, but I have no direct student contact. And I'm tasked with running a student experience mapping project. So I really need to bridge that gap of understanding where I'm looking at the org chart and the students are looking at actually what their experience looks like. So hopefully this will help you as well. So anybody really, using a bit of an imagination, can come up with the journey along the top, where a student goes through registration and they end up being assessed and then they become alumni. And from our parts of the organisation, if we're in higher education, we're sitting in our various silos looking at that. And we all have a different role with respect to the various aspects of the journey. So we all see it from a different viewpoint. And that's illustrated there in the colours. But what's actually happening is each individual student is going on this really long, winding journey, and it's unique to them. My journey as a student isn't going to be the same as Jeremy's because we're in different disciplines, we have different personal circumstances. And as staff members, we're sitting in our offices looking at that with completely different hats on. So when we're looking at understanding the student's journey and then trying to improve it, we're coming at it with different agendas, different viewpoints, and not even necessarily speaking the same language. So in an ideal world, that would be unified. We'd have a common agenda, a common understanding, and we'd be able to work together across the silos to improve the student experience in an impactful way. So this is where experience mapping comes in. And I found this distinction useful when I was trying to wrap my head around experience mapping, and it's this distinction between processes, journeys, and experience. So at the very bottom, we have process, and anybody in LHE, if you've done process mapping, you'll understand what this means. It's detailed step-by-step actions that are taken to achieve something. And if you abstract that a bit more, you have a journey. So it's a just deeper understanding of the path that a person has taken. And if you wanted to get an understanding of someone's journey, you'd be looking at defining the persona. So a female computer science student going on her journey throughout the university, if you were to try and map my student journey. And you'd be looking at how that persona feels about specific scenarios. So you're still quite detailed. But when you're looking at experience, it's much more abstract than that. You're looking at an institutional level of understanding. And what you can do at this level is think about all students. So what's the common experience for all students? You're asking a broad question. You're not asking specific questions about particular parts of the journey. You're asking about how the student perceives their experience at an overall level. And where the experience comes useful is at an institutional level, being able to set up a strategic approach to improving the experience, where everybody has that common agenda, no matter which silo that you're sitting in. So that leads me to the student experience mapping project. And our starting hypothesis then is, by developing a shared understanding of our students' perspective of UCD, we will develop a common unifying agenda to improve what matters most to our students. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. What we want to do is see through the eyes of our students. So we want a better understanding of what's actually important to them, and we want that to be our shared understanding. No matter what silo I'm sitting in, we should all have the same understanding. And then we want to use that to do something. So we want to have take action that has a direct positive impact on the student experience. And then from a UCD Agile perspective, what we're looking at doing is increasing the agility and effectiveness of the university. We want to make it easier for multifunctional, cross-silo, customer-focused improvements by identifying what's most important to them. So it's very focused on the student. As with, I think you'll probably laugh when you look at this, because if we're all in higher education, we're used to the complex governance structures. Just to give you a sense, this will be important when we get to a later part of the presentation, but the project team sits here. We had a driver group, which were our stakeholders who helped us design the project proposal, and we consulted with them throughout. As a project manager, I reported into a steering committee led by the Dean of Students. Fair enough, it's totally relevant. That project steering committee reported into the Agile steering committee because it was part of our plan. And then we reported into the university management team student experience group, because student experience is their remit, and then reported up into the university management team. So the primary route is this one in terms of the presentation that we're talking about here. It'll be relevant later. So in practice then, what did running the student experience mapping project look like? And I feel like this is a good illustration to kind of guide the discussion around what happened. So the first thing that we needed to do is agree, who are we talking about? So this project focused on all undergraduate and top graduate students. We left out research students because we recognised it was a completely different experience, but we wanted broad institutional level understanding of the experience of all undergraduate and top graduate students. So then what we need to do is figure out, how do we reach these students? How do we understand what their experience is? Well, we need a sample, but actually we only need an indicative sample. So we reached out, we did a recruitment campaign, we offered free pizza and vouchers, and we recruited students, and we looked at the demographics of the students who had applied for a position in the workshops, and we picked out a cross section of them based on the discipline and their gender and demographics like that. So we had a really diverse sample of students who were coming in. The next thing we did is we had an external company doing the workshop facilitation for us, because we wanted it to be an independent person asking. So the students weren't in a room being questioned by UCD staff member. They felt they could be open and honest. And we got them to take a really unstructured approach. We didn't want the students to be biased by the questions that they were being asked. So they were asked things like, what's the best part about being a UCD student? Or what's top of mind? What top of mind, positive and negative, creating a balanced view, and then letting the students lead the conversation. So the things that they brought up are the things that got followed up on and we got more detail on. At the same time as talking to the students, we also asked staff for their viewpoint. So anybody who is frontline working with students knows the university. And what you get when you use an unstructured workshop approach with the students is they'll talk about the things that are most important to them, which is perfect. We want that. But what we end up with then is gaps, because the students aren't being comprehensive, if you like. So by talking to staff as well, you get the whole picture. The staff perspective and the student perspective will end up being very different, and we'll see that in a minute as well. So the next thing that you want to do is identify the common themes. So we're looking for institutional level empathy, what matters most to all students. And obviously specific disciplines or specific demographics may have their own trends, but we're using an indicative sample to get the overall picture. So what are the common themes that are coming up across that hold true across all of the cohorts? All of those insights are really, really valuable if you take action. So the next thing to do is come up with the actions or recommendations based on those insights. What are we going to do as a consequence of knowing these things? And then finally, keeping the insights alive. We'll come back to that in a minute when we're talking about the COVID experience. So just a little bit on the collaboration side of it. I mentioned that we got the staff involved. There was 112 staff or faculty involved across 48 different units. So what we did was we made sure to involve staff so that we could have as full a picture as possible of the overall student experience from end to end. And then in terms of the students, we involved 109 students from actually 2 different campuses to make sure that we captured any variation in the experience between those students. So at the end of the project then, what we ended up with is the student perspective. And as tangible things, what that looks like is the map, which you can see here, and a set of insights. Well, we actually had a very detailed report that we kind of synthesized the insights out of. We also ended up with a picture of the UCD ecosystem, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but what that came from is the staff description of the student experience. So the student map that we have here is a relatively simple view of the student experience overall, but the power of it is that it's from what the students were talking about. It's using terminology and structure that emerged from the students' conversations. And having talked to the staff and faculty in the university and gotten a really comprehensive overview of what's available, what the touch points are for students across the university, what we were able to do was to create the ecosystem using the structure of the student map so that it'd be easy to understand from the student perspective. So just to dig down into a bit of that so that you can see what I mean, what we have is the details of the student journey that we know about from the staff perspective, even though students didn't use all of that detail. And then we have the component from the student map that came from how the student does describe the university. But we have the details of all of the touch points that we know about. And obviously not all of these would have been mentioned by students. So this comes in handy for later on when we're delivering some of the improvements, because we have the expertise and knowledge about the university. If I just go back, the other 2 things that came out of it as outputs, were the recommendations, which I'll come to in a second, and actually experience mapping itself. So the use of experience mapping and the value and being able to repeat experience mapping within the university. So this back to the seen through the eyes of the students, the map that came out has a lot of detail behind it, and all of this detail came out in the report. But what we did was we tried to summarize it in a way that was digestible for staff members. And some of the key insights are on this slide and the next one, and I just want to dwell on them for a minute. The first thing that we discovered is that students live and learn as one. So they don't differentiate between their life as a student and the time that they're studying or they're in lectures. And that sounds obvious, and I kind of alluded to that at the start when I spoke about not just being lectures, but it's really important to recognise that they don't see the university in the structured way that we do. They focus most on the here and now. And a good example for anybody in higher education is around orientation. When we're talking about orientation and giving them all the information that they need, what they're thinking about is being a new student or exploring the campus. And they're not necessarily digesting the information we're giving them because they don't need it just yet. They self-navigate the UCD landscape as and when needs arise. So that's building on that. When they have a need, then they try to figure out, how do I meet that need within the campus? Their needs are highest when capacity to navigate UCD is least developed. So you can imagine a new student to the university, they might have the most needs, they most likely do, but they at the same time, they don't know how to get what they need. So recognizing that has important consequences for how we support them. On top of that, then we have a nice balanced view where we have some positives and some constructive criticisms. So it's good to see that UCD students are proud of their connections. They're proud when they get to say, to prospective employers that they're a UCD student. They think it looks good. They live and learn is one, we know that. They live and learn on campus outside 9 to 5. So it's interesting when you think about how campus makes services available to students and they have particular opening hours, but actually students are studying on campus outside of those times and they want to be able to access food and drink, for example. But they do believe that in the main, the campus enhances their experience. They just want to be self-sufficient within that environment. There was interesting things that come up around transport and accommodation having an impact, a knock-on effect on their overall experience, more significant than maybe was appreciated before. And the cumulative cost of being a student having an impact. So this isn't about fees and the obvious things that cost a lot of money. It's about the cost of food and printing and things like that. Library fines is a common one that comes up. They trust in the expertise of the faculty and they appreciate the opportunities they have as students, whether it's internships or societies or student leadership positions. They perceive variation in their learning experiences. So if I'm on a computer science program and Jeremy's in arts, there's variation naturally because of the difference in the disciplines. But when they come together through these opportunities, such as in societies, they start seeing those differences and there's a perception that sometimes that might be unfair. It's just recognizing that. They appreciate the comprehensive offering of services and supports and the UCD staff they encounter. So it's interesting when you tie them all together because students recognize that our university makes a lot of things available to them with the potential to meet the needs that they have. It's just how do I access them when I have a need? That's where the challenge arises. Related to that then, they're overwhelmed by the amount of information they receive. They get a lot of emails, in part because UCD are trying and the staff are trying to make them aware of all of the supports and services available to them. But because of the sheer quantity of it, they just don't really pay attention necessarily to the email. They prefer to receive the information through word of mouth. And related to that, they turn to their trusted person for guidance and support. This is a really interesting one to me because the university makes available a lot of student-facing staff for students to engage with. And you would think that they are the trusted person, but not always. Sometimes it could be their favourite academic. It could be the person, the administrator they encountered when they were registering. It could be one of their fellow students. It's not necessarily the person that we think it is. So that's a snapshot of what we learned about our students' experience. And given I have a bit of an international audience here, I know not all of you are student facing, but if you are, or if you have a sense of how to answer this question that I'm posing, does this sound like it could be your students? If Jeremy could launch that poll, I'd like to see if there's a response to it.
Sure, and as that poll is running, I'll just let you know there's a couple of questions and they're mostly around the actual workshops themselves, the workshop gathering feedback from the students. Do you want to take those now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one in the Q&A from Diana McPherson, who's asked, were the experience maps for the students gathered from the informal sessions with them, or were there several sessions? And also, what were some of the facilitative techniques used to get this information?
So the workshops themselves were run by Murdoch, who are our external researchers, and the techniques that they used were to ask open-ended questions. So you can imagine a room where there's 12 students sitting around in a circle, and the facilitator would say, so actually the first thing she did was she got them to write on Post-its. What are the top 3 things you think of when it comes to being a UCD student? And they all wrote them down individually and put them up. And then you used that input to guide the conversation. So it was student-led. So that's how the workshops were run. There was a sequence of workshops that had particular student cohorts in them so that the students would feel comfortable to participate. So for example, we put the STEM first year and second year students all in one workshop, 12 of them, because we felt that they were a similar enough cohort that they'd be more likely to be open and frank and honest, rather than mixing them up with the arts and humanities fourth years, for example. So all of that work, the outputs of all of those workshops were analysed by our research partners after the workshops to come up with the insights.
It's great. That actually also answers Roberta's question on who facilitated the sessions, and
Yeah.
pretty much Sarah's question on what kind of questions were asked, which is the open-ended questions about their experiences. So all covered. I'm going to end the polling now and share the results.
Completely, mostly, somewhat. I think that's really interesting. And I was kind of being selfish asking because I was really, really curious. But when I'm working with staff around the student experience and we go through these insights, I ask them every time, does any of this surprise you at all? And they always say no. And that tells me a few things. It tells me that people who are working with students really do understand their students. But it also tells me that it's really, sorry, the other side of it is that they're kind of astonished to see it all in one place for the first time. It's like they knew it, but they hadn't seen it before, if that makes sense. So it's really valuable to be able to put it really concisely based on the feedback I've had. So thanks for sharing that. And it's interesting that it holds true for people in other universities too. I think somebody's kind of human.
Can I just jump in very quickly before you move on to the next slide and ask? It was 109 students, wasn't it, that were involved as part of? Okay,
yeah,
that answers that question too. Great.
Fab. Okay, so how much time do I have left? Grant, loads of time. So we have the student perspective, and the value of that is really what you do with it. So part of the analysis was to identify what are the things that we can do about this in response to the student perspective. So coming up with a common agenda, not focused on students, because we can do that quite easily. It's focused by students. So what's most important to students that we need to do something about? So there was 4 areas that came up, 3 of which turned into practical programs of work. So the first is shaping living and learning. We gave them all shorthand names. So the purpose of the first one was to better enable students to shape their UCD environments to their needs. So this is quite a broad institutional level purpose. So each of these projects were given a project lead and a project team and set up to be run, to come up with action items out of them. So they're quite big projects. Findability then, really important, improve our ability to connect students to the information and supports they need when they look for it, no pressure. Trusted person. So this really interesting insight that a student might not turn to the person you put in front of them, but could turn to anybody. So how do you make it easier to be a trusted person and thereby improve our ability to connect students to the information and supports they need? And just to pick up on that one before I move on, actually, one of the really interesting things that came up, having done the work with the staff before the students, was that it wasn't just students who found it hard to navigate the university. It's a really complex organization. Staff found it difficult to navigate. So part of the trusted person issue is, even if a student does go to a staff member, they don't always know how to navigate on the student's behalf. So that was a really important project. The last one there, variation. So analyze where variation in the learning experience is valuable and where inconsistencies must be avoided to ensure a minimum standard for our students' experience in UCD. The interesting one on that is that there was already a lot of activity happening in the university around the variation across disciplines. So we didn't pursue that one as a program of activity like we did the other 3. So putting this into context then, what happened next could be a session or 3 on its own. So I'm just going to summarize it really, really quickly. We had 3 big projects that were running, 2 reporting into the Dean of Students and 1 reporting into the Director of Estates. The Shaping Living and Learning one obviously was the Estates. And I supported them kind of like as a program manager. And the way we progressed them was as a series of what we called rapid improvement events, but in the true lean sense, that's not what they were. They were like a UCD variation, because we weren't going into it with a clean process. We were going into them with kind of high level insights and objectives to come out with projects really out of them. So between September and January, those 3 projects progressed in full and resulted in a series of outputs, project recommendations that were brought back to UMT SEG, if you remember my complex governance structure in March. But just to look at what those outputs were briefly. On the trusted person one, so in each of the events, what we had staff involved from a cross-section of the university who were able to explore in more detail what the student perspective on the topic, what the consequences of that were, but also to bring in the staff perspective, and was really interested in kind of outputs that we ended up with. On the trusted person one, what came out of that was the principles of a trusted person. So what does the university expect of a trusted person, whether it's a staff member or a student or whoever? Guidelines for dealing with distressed students, the supports map. So the most important part of the outputs overall, I would say, is the supports map that helps staff navigate the university and students to navigate the university. On the findability, just a couple of those ones. A knowledge sharing group, because there was a lack of coordination within the university around the information being made available to students. So how can we have better coherence and coordination when we're making information available? The kind of fractured nature of the websites came up as a big issue. So how do students find the information when they search or they navigate? So there was an output to create a landing web page for students. And then another big one would have been the review of the targeted communication system. So the system through which emails are targeted at students. How can we have an understanding of how and why those emails are getting sent, what types of emails, and do something about it, whether it's a policy or a new mechanism for communicating with the students. On the Shaping Living and Learning one, what was really interesting is that, so some of it was around access to self-catering facilities, because we know students want to be able to look after themselves on campus, and access to study space when they're outside lecture times, and charging points and all of those practical things. One of the really interesting things was how important sustainability is to students. So one of the outputs of the Living and Learning project was development of a draft waste management policy. Now, bearing in mind, these things weren't all just produced in that short amount of time. It was, the output was, we're going to do projects to do these things. So all of that stuff went to UMT-SEG, Student Experience Group, in March, and they were endorsed. And as far as we were concerned, job done, we did great. Back to our hypothesis, we wanted to develop a common unifying agenda to deliver what matters most to our students. And we did that, and isn't that great? And then COVID happened. So that kind of made things a little bit more complex than you might have liked at the end of a big project like that. And it makes us think back to the student experience, which is now changed based on the notifications that we get from the registrar and the president around moving to online learning to simplify that story. So the student experience now looks very different. So after doing all of that work, what does that mean? What can we do? So just to put it back into context again, we went to UMT-SEG with those outputs to be endorsed in March, and within the space of a few days, we got the notification from the university management team that we all need to go to work from home. And to simplify the story, education is now online. So on the right-hand side, then you'll see there was a bit more work that needed to be done to make sure that we got value out of all the effort that had been put into the student experience mapping project. So a few questions that we had. How am I doing for time? Okay. Can the student perspective inform our response to COVID-19? Can we make sure that we get value out of this? Can our planned programme of work still continue? Can the student perspective be used to assess the potential impact of COVID-19 on students? So these are things that we need to look at. One of the really interesting things was how, and I think this is true for the staff experience at the university too, COVID-19 emphasised some of the issues that we were seeking to address through the project. So being able to connect people with the information and supports they need when they look for it. There is no other time when it has been more difficult or more important to be able to connect with the information you need and the supports and services that you need. So one of the things that happened is a lot of the work that was done in both the Findability and Trusted Person project was used as part of the COVID-19 response. They fast-tracked the development of a online information portal, if you like, for students to be able to quickly find out what's available on campus for them. And work that had been done as part of the Trusted Person project and that mammoth UCD ecosystem that I showed you earlier that was developed based on the staff inputs, all of that information was sucked into this response to make sure that the information that they needed was made available in one place in an easy to find way. In terms of adapting the programme of work, nothing was taken away, But what we did do was hone in on what's more important now based on what we know about the student experience. So there's some adaptations or extensions, if you like, being made to the guidelines around dealing with distressed students, because there's different things distressing students and they're in a different environment now. So how do you deal with a distressed student who's not even in the same room as you? The supports map obviously need to be updated because how you access supports has changed and the opening hours and what's available. Some of the findability stuff has been escalated to happen more quickly because obviously it's even more important now. The access to self-catering facilities, so there was microwaves made available on campus as a consequence of this project. It would be crazy if it wasn't, but the rest of that work had to be delayed because the use of campus is a lot more complex now. And interesting, back to the sustainability issue, the development of a waste management policy is even more complex now because you've got PPE, you've got face masks, you've got reusable cups all over campus. So there's things that need to be adapted, but actually the program of work needs to continue and some of it needs to happen a lot more quickly than we thought before. Finally, the last thing that we've been doing recently is looking at how the framework can be used, how the outputs from the Student Experience Mapping Project can be used to assess the impact of COVID-19 on student experience. So last week I had a workshop with some of the frontline staff who work very closely with students, and we use this, what you see in front of you, as a framework for discussion. We ranked each of those statements in order of priority to be discussed. And we're running a series of workshops where we look at each statement independently and say, okay, well, what does this mean for students now in the current context? And then what can we do about it? The consequence of these discussions or the outcome of these discussions are sometimes joining the dots between things that are already happening. So, for example, me getting in touch with Jeremy about a project he's running and making sure that around here, the findability stuff, linking with Jeremy on a project where he's doing stuff and making sure it takes into account the stuff that the frontline staff are coming up with, as well as the student experience project, as well as starting bigger projects. So there's now going to be a coordinated approach to peer mentor feedback that's being driven by the staff involved in working with the peer mentors, because they recognise that they are key to helping students navigate the university, especially from a distance. They're a really good route to being able to support students. So the key takeaways, if I believe, based on our experience, that experience mapping is a powerful tool for capturing the institutional view of students' perspective. Based on the feedback that I've had from the staff that I've worked with or I've spoken to about it in the university, they have said things like, we already knew all this. Why are we only doing something about it now? Well, the answer to that is because we never actually had the evidence before. We just knew it. Experience mapping gives us that evidence at an institutional level and the permission to act, if you like. Having a single view of the student perspective makes that cross-silo collaboration easier, and that's related to the previous point. If we all see the same evidence, it makes it easier for us to all work towards it. And experience mapping is a point in time exercise, and that's one of the things that when we spoke about the insights that we're talking about, we'd always say in February 2019, students felt that, and you'd have to bear in mind when the assessment period was and all of those things. But actually, COVID has proved to us that it's a very useful framework for further exploration as time passes and as circumstances changed. It is something that you'd want to repeat in more detail after a period of time, but it doesn't go out of date if you keep it alive through conversations. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, Jeremy, happy to take them.
Yeah, so there's a good bit of activity in the chat and a question as well. Just to note the chat stuff first, there's something there, and there's a good bit there in relation to how COVID impacted on people and what they were doing and how it's exposed process weaknesses. And then a couple of people have noted what we would have said already, particularly in sessions yesterday, at how it's made change more possible because there's so much change happening anyway. There's less resistance to change.
Jeremy, I'm going to throw that one back at you because you had an interesting session yesterday, and this was a big topic in it. Can you tell the attendees a bit about that?
In relation to
the remote working group, I think that's a really interesting one to bring up.
In relation to change, yeah, so we've definitely found, I mean, I was running a project, I'm still running a project that involves introducing changes to areas, asking people to do things in new ways, and it was actually arguably more difficult to implement changes before COVID. Now people see it as an opportunity to take control over what's going on and have a bit more say in the changes that are happening around them. So COVID-19 has been interesting as far as its impacts on how people perceive threats and how people are less resistant to changes in their day-to-day. And to throw a question back at you then, Olga, in the Q&A, Jonathan's asking about how you go about developing trusted persons who can possess such a vast array of knowledge of university services.
It's a really good question, and we have debated this to no end. And I don't think it's that we try to develop trusted persons who have that vast knowledge. I think it's that we need to make sure that the information we're making that information accessible at your fingertips. So one of the outcomes from that project, particularly, is the student support map. And if I just go back, if I can make you dizzy for a second, in fact, I'll do it this way. If I go back to this slide here, one of the things that you see very frequently in UCD is this org chart, basically. And the idea with the Trusted Person project is, what at a glance picture can we create that would help any trusted person? If they just were familiar with this picture and somebody said, I'm having an issue with, they could glance at that map and say, I know where you need to go. I know who can help you. So it's not that we try to develop a person in a particular way to have particular information. It's what do we make available to make it easier for them to navigate.
Yeah, that's a key thing I've seen as a real value. That's resonated with so many people on the project that I'm running as well, is this concept of how do I make it easier to be a trusted person in the university. And a lot of the time those trusted people exist in pockets, in silos. They're experts in their own areas. It's about connecting them together and giving them the skills to connect with one another.
Yeah.
Question there from John: love the design of the whole project and how representative the outputs ended up being. If you were doing this again in say 5 years though, is there anything you would do differently?
Oh, always, lots I would do differently. This is like an interview question. I'm under pressure. What would I do differently? I think it would depend on what it is that I'm looking to achieve. So if I'm doing it again at an institutional level, I think I would do the staff workshops after the student workshops, because I would be interested in fleshing the the staff perspective of it out based on the student perspective, if that makes sense. So what we did the first time was we had the staff perspective, and we had it as a journey and all the touch points. And then we went and we spoke to the students. We didn't tell the students what the staff said. So the students started with a blank page. It'd be very interesting if we took the student perspective and got the staff to flesh that out, rather than retrofitting it afterwards. I think the picture that would give us would be very interesting. And I think it would be another learning opportunity, another trigger for staff to reflect on the student experience in more detail.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a comment or a question in the chat actually. Did you have someone from IT services involved?
So we had somebody from IT services came to the staff. Yes, we did. So we had people from IT services involved in the that group that helped us develop the proposal. And then we had people from IT services in the staff workshops.
Okay, great. A question here from Diana. I might be, well, how did you capture the maps for the student staff experiences? That might be phrased as maybe how did you decide on the structure of the maps, or how did you basically visualize the map? So
that must be very annoying flicking through the slides. So I'm not sure specifically what the question is asking, but this map here came from the research partners who basically visualized the various components. That what they were hearing from students was the stuff around living and learning, but it kind of happens at the same time, and the various components that they were talking about. So they just structured it in that way. And then the staff, the ecosystem that came from the staff, we took the structure, we wanted it to be as true to the student perspective as we could, with all of the extra information in it. So we took the structure of what the students had, what was produced from what the students said, and we just fleshed it out with more detail on it. If it was a more technical question around it, we used draw.io to fill in the details. That's a free web app, basically.
Thanks. There's a question here from Jonathan, which I think will resonate with quite a few people. Could you comment on the role of student information systems? There seems to be an inclination to create giant, broad student systems that are complex, full of interfaces, and difficult to maintain and keep accurate. Is experience mapping moving UCD in a different direction?
Well, this is one, Jeremy, that I'd throw back at you. I mentioned earlier on that one of the outcomes from the discussions we were having around findability was the need to join the dots and link in with existing or with other initiatives that are happening. So what would you say to that, Jeremy, with your project?
I would say, to keep my positive hat on, the experience mapping project and what students experienced at the university highlighted was that there was an opportunity to be had in joining things up a bit in that findability one in particular, and making it easier for students to navigate the university. The ecosystem that exists to support them exists independently of the information systems that are there. It certainly seems, and I think experience in a lot of institutions would be, that the information systems don't help you navigate. In fact, you have to figure out how to navigate the information systems that are there. And I think that's probably true for staff as well. You figure out how to put the pieces together. So is experience mapping moving UCD in a different direction? I think it's helping us move in a different direction. I think there were already initiatives that were looking at that kind of thing, and it's definitely allowing us to put more context and further arguments that would need to be there to make it, to push it forward and make it happen. So definitely.
And I think, just to build on what you're saying there, one of the things that we'll be doing out of this project is feeding into our digitalization strategy. And there'll be a big emphasis on just-in-time, in context information. I can't remember what the right phrase for that is, but having the information in the context where you need it. So if you're navigating a particular system and you need to do something, you have the information relative to that at that point in that system, as opposed to having to go somewhere else to find it. Somebody in the chat will correct me and tell me what the right phrase is for that, because it's gone out of my head. All that stuff though, hopefully the outputs of this, when we feed them through, will influence things in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And and just to kind of strengthen that a little bit, what it does is it provides, I think I may have already said this, but just to reinforce it, it gives us more of a framework or a basis upon which to be stronger in our arguments that things need to change, or the direction that things need to move in, which just makes it easier to solidify your the way you move and the way you move initiatives forward. So definitely very, very valuable from that perspective.
Very good question.
Brilliant question. Yeah. I think that's it from the questions.
That's great. I was going to say, it's Friday. Everybody should be able to go home early, but everybody's only starting their days.
Yes, different time zones. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Yeah. Did you want to do a quick shout out for the next session, Olga, in LHE before we?
Yes, I do. Share screen. There. Hopefully in 2021, we'll all be able to meet in person, and I will see you at the Lean in HE conference in Glasgow, 20th to the 22nd of October. See you there. And thanks for coming, everybody.